Good morning. Looks like we have some folks joining us. We'll let everyone get connected in just a second. Well, happy Thursday. Hope you all are doing well. Welcome to Digging into Brownfields, preparing a competitive EPA Brownfield grant application. My name is Kelly Weston with Centralina Regional Council, and I'm part of the team leading Centralina's Regional Brownfields program. I'm joined by my colleagues from Centralina, Malin Joyner and Kasha Thompson. And we're excited to bring you this webinar in partnership with the New Jersey Institute of Technology's Technical Assistance to Brownfield Communities program and the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. And we're joined today by technical experts from both organizations who you will hear from shortly, so I will let them introduce themselves later on. But here is our agenda for today. So we're going to start with a brief overview of Centralina's Brownfields program. New Jersey Institute of Technology's TAB program will be sharing some brownfield basics and tips and tricks for preparing a grant application. And then the EPA will walk us through the brownfield grant process. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started. We are recording today's session, so you'll receive a link to the recording and a follow-up email. We have a lot of information that we want to share with you, so our presenters are going to keep things moving, but we will have time to take questions at the end of the webinar. In the meantime, we encourage you to use the chat to post any questions that may come up during the presentations, and we'll just make sure that we get all of them answered. So just a little bit about Centralina Regional Council. We are the council of governments that serves the 9-county Greater Charlotte region by offering planning, coordination, advocacy, and technical assistance services to local communities. About a year ago, we received a $1.5 million Brownfields Assessment Coalition grant from the EPA to allow us to assist our communities in transforming vacant, underused properties into vital assets that would support the local economy. And this grant funds site assessment, cleanup and reuse planning, and community engagement activities. And our partners in this effort are the EPA, NJIT TAB, and the engineering firm Stantec. Now, the Central Honor region, like a lot of regions, it's a fast-growing region, and with that growth, there are challenges. But Brownfields redevelopment, we've seen offers opportunities to address those growth-related challenges. So in terms of mobility and housing, these redevelopment projects can create new local jobs and also expand housing options to help support the local housing supply. Redevelopment can also turn properties that have health and safety liabilities due to contamination into vital community assets. And these redevelopment projects can support the local economy by increasing property values and expanding the tax base and just overall helping to promote efficient land use. So to meet the funding objectives of the grant, we've designed the Regional Brownfields program around these main elements, these three components. So the first is site strategy and engagement facilitation, and this is really to help support communities in identifying and assessing brownfield sites, developing cleanup and reuse strategies, and also engaging community stakeholders throughout the process. And we're doing this through the technical work that the engineering firm Stantec is leading. We're also compiling an inventory of potential sites across the region and forming an advisory committee to help us select and prioritize those sites for assessments. And we're also working on creating a peer networking opportunity for the communities that are participating in the program, just so they can share their progress and any lessons learned along the way. The second component is really education and technical learning, such as today's webinar. So we're providing these workshops and learning sessions to help local leaders and stakeholders build their knowledge and capacity around brownfields redevelopment. And then finally, grant and funding guidance. So we're supporting communities in identifying brownfields funding opportunities. Again, this webinar is another opportunity to do that. And also providing them and connecting them with resources to help them prepare competitive grant applications. So in applying for the EPA grant, we partnered with 3 of our member communities to identify some initial sites in our region for those first assessment activities. And these sites are all former manufacturing facilities, and they include the NC Finishing Company property in the town of Spencer. Actually, two sites in the city of Mount Holly. That's the Adrian Mill and the Medora Mill. And the Dawson Dyeing and Finishing Facility in the city of Albemarle. So this is where our initial assessments will focus on. So looking ahead to our activities for this fall, we are going to continue our site preparation and site readiness work that is already underway. We have learning opportunities, again, today's webinar, and also another event coming up in October, and I'll share more on that at the end of today's session. And then later this year, we'll be forming that Brownfields Advisory Committee that I mentioned earlier to help us inform our site selection and prioritization of other properties across the region. So that is just kind of a high-level overview of Centralina's Brownfields program. With that, I am going to turn it over to my partner, Elise, with the NJIT TAB program. Elise?
Thanks, Kelly. Hi, everyone. Good morning. Thanks for joining us. I will preface and start off by saying I am recovering from a cold. I think like half of the population right now. So I may pause, mute myself just to cough. So just giving a heads up now. But again, my name is Elise Muller. Welcome to this grant writing workshop put on by Centralina and NJIT TAB. I wanted to say that the session today was made possible with funding from the EPA, but none of the statements that I make today constitute official EPA advice, interpretations, or positions. So with that, I'm going to go into an agenda for my portion of this presentation. We're going to start with the TAB program and how we can help. So I'm going to go through a lot of information. We know that brownfields can take a lot of work. And so to kind of preface all of that information, I wanted to start with how we can help. So if you have questions throughout my presentation, these are different ways that we can assist you. And then from there, why do we redevelop brownfields? A little bit of a brownfield basics, brownfield 101, and then getting into the EPA fiscal year 26 grants, and then early application tasks. These are building your grant team, creating your vision, writing your story, and setting up your application. And we're waiting for this NOFO to come out any day now, but it's never too late to get started early, right? Excuse me. So NJIT TAB, that's New Jersey Institute of Technology's Technical Assistance to Brownfield Communities program. NJIT TAB is a little bit less of a mouthful. So we serve as a free independent resource to state, territory, regional, county, tribal, and local government entities and nonprofits that are attempting to learn about, identify, assess, clean up, or maybe redevelop their brownfield sites. And we provide assistance in three main ways. The first main way is our Brownfields Academy. This is all of our online resources. So we have previously recorded webinars, upcoming events, how-to videos, learning modules, and even successful grant applications as well. And then our next main way is our community engagement educational forums. And this is where we can come to your community. We can hold something virtual like this. It can be a Brownfield Basics workshop and going through the overall gists of brownfields. Why are there so many? Where did they come from? What potential do they offer? Grant writing workshops like this as well, community workshops on a brownfield related specific topic, conferences. Also, Breaking Brownfields is a really fun event that we do. And this is basically where a government entity, a nonprofit, presents their specific brownfield challenges to a panel of experts. This can be attorneys, real estate developers, funding specialists, and they receive feedback on their brownfield challenge. It's really, really cool and fun, and we're actually going to have one in a later summit this year, late October, that Kelly is actually going to talk about, so stay tuned till the end. And then brownfield summits. But really our main bread and butter that I like to say is our one-on-one technical assistance. This is where we offer tailored guidance that's specific to your community. So one thing that we won't do is come into your community and tell you what's best for your community. You know your community best. So we can answer brownfield related questions, explain cleanup technologies, and one big thing that I want to add on to this presentation is that we can review your grant application. Excuse me. So that includes receiving your grant application in a Word document, sending it back with guidance, feedback, edits, comments, just things that we believe that the EPA reviewers may like to see or that you should touch on or maybe take out of your application. And again, all of our assistance is free. And I do want to say that once the notice of funding opportunity or NOFO comes out, the EPA is not able to answer questions unless it's about site eligibility, but we can. So with that, let's get into a brownfield basics. What is a brownfield? So the US EPA defines a brownfield as real property, the expansion, redevelopment, or reuse of which may be complicated by the presence or potential presence of a hazardous substance, pollutant, or contaminant. Keywords are presence or potential presence. Now, the North Carolina Department of Environmental Quality defines a brownfield site as an abandoned, idled, or underused property where the threat of environmental contamination has hindered its redevelopment. Let's briefly talk about the negative impacts of brownfield sites and why we might not want them sitting around in our neighborhoods. Take a look at these screenshots from North Carolina news articles that contain phrases like neighbors concerned about vacant house, injured firefighter, 80 homes abandoned, neighbors say closed golf course, eyesore, and then abandoned, vandalized, closed hospital. So brownfields can contribute to neighborhood deterioration and negative perceptions of the neighborhood. They can attract vandals, open dumping, maybe other unwanted criminal activity. They can degrade soil, water, and air quality, and potentially cause public health issues. Then they can lower property values, reduce employment opportunities, and can lead to lost tax revenue and limited economic growth. But having brownfield sites does come with some advantages. Many of these sites are located along waterways and rail lines, or maybe central roadways and interstates, as well as within central downtown areas, so their locations can be really advantageous for redevelopment. On top of them, many of these sites have existing infrastructure like utility and sewer lines, or maybe they hold historical and architectural significance. I use this example all the time, but I drive by this beautiful, beautiful building with stained glass windows and detailed woodwork on the outside, and it's just sitting there vacant. And I see this every day on my way to work, and I just think, it's such a shame. So looking through the lens of what's known as a triple bottom line, which is improving the environment, benefiting the economy, and then improving the community, cleaning up and redeveloping brownfield sites really touches upon all three. So the first one is the environment. Simply put, we're improving the environment because we're removing pollution when we clean up brownfield sites. And then redeveloping brownfield sites can also improve a community's economic conditions by catalyzing economic development, creating jobs, increasing tax revenue, and diversifying the local economic base. And then finally, redeveloping brownfield sites helps to improve community conditions in so many different ways. This can be removing safety and health hazards, removing eyesores, and improving community appearances, alleviating community fears and worries, and then finally transforming those properties into community needed uses like housing, recreation, schools, healthcare facilities, and so on. Oh, there we go. Okay. So redeveloped brownfields are really the key ingredients to creating safe, vibrant, and resilient communities, but the process of cleaning up and redeveloping these contaminated properties can be a daunting task. And most of these activities, like determining the presence of contaminants in the soil, water, air, and building materials, engaging the community, hiring and managing consultants and contractors, these activities cost money. They require money. So let's talk about the EPA Brownfield grants. You're eligible for an EPA Brownfield grant if you are a state, county, local, or tribal government or a nonprofit organization. And brownfield projects are funded and financed by multiple sources, so grants, loans, tax incentives, and the EPA Brownfield Program grants are going to become available later this year as we anticipate. Generally, these grants are available on an annual basis. So for those who may not know, there's generally 5 main types of grants available through the EPA Brownfields program. The 4 MARC grants, Multipurpose Assessment Revolving Loan Fund and Cleanup, so MARC, MARC, and then job training. So for the multi-purpose grant, this provides funding for a range of planning, assessment, and cleanup activities at 1 or more brownfield sites in target areas. The assessment grant provides funding for activities like making brownfield inventories, planning, environmental site assessments, and community outreach. The revolving loan fund grants provides funding to capitalize loans that are used to clean up the brownfields. And the cleanup grants, pretty self-explanatory, provides funding to carry out cleanup activities at brownfield sites by the applicant. Now, the job training grant is designed to recruit, train, and place unemployed and underemployed residents from communities that are impacted by brownfields. Now, the notice of funding opportunity for the fiscal year 26 job training grants were released on July 21st, and the applications are actually due tomorrow, Friday, September 26th. Now, not all awards are anticipated every year, so the multipurpose and the RLF switch off every other year. This year, multipurpose awards are anticipated and RLF awards are not anticipated. On top of that, there's two types of assessment grants, the community-wide assessment grants and assessment coalition grants. So community-wide assessment grants are appropriate for communities that are beginning to address their brownfield challenges, as well as for communities that have ongoing efforts to bring sites into productive reuse. Assessment coalition grants have one lead entity that partners with typically 2 to 4 non-lead entities that do not have the capacity to apply for or maybe manage their own grant. So the lead entity must be state, tribal, county, or local government or regional council established under federal, state, or local law. And then on top of that, there must be at least one non-lead member that has never been awarded a MARC grant, and non-leads cannot be affiliated with another non-lead. So for entities that want to apply for an assessment coalition grant, just note that organizing a successful assessment coalition and putting in place the necessary agreements does take time. Now, as I mentioned before, the EPA solicits these grants typically on an annual basis. So here's the typical solicitation cycle that we will see. The Notice of Funding Opportunity, or NOFO, will be released in the early fall, and last year it was on September 3rd. The application submission date is typically around 8 or 9 weeks after the request for application. So last year is November 14th, which is a little more than 10 weeks since the NOFO. The EPA then announces the successful applicants the following spring. This past fiscal year, the grant awards were announced on May 16th. And finally, the funding becomes available to grantees in late summer. So again, approximately, it's a timeline of roughly 1 year from that initial NOFO to the final step of the grant funds being available to the successful applicant. Now, up in this table, the grant awards for fiscal year 26. These amounts are from the EPA's MARC Grant Resources webpage, and that indicates that the EPA is anticipating offering these grant awards for fiscal year 26. They do note that all amounts are subject to change. While the job training grant is not listed here, the EPA does anticipate granting 20 awards totaling $14 million. The highest amount that anyone applying for a job training grant can receive is $500,000. All right, so why is starting early important? Oh, there we go. Why is starting early important in preparing a competitive application? So the first thing, and as I mentioned, there are roughly 8-ish weeks from the notice of funding opportunity to submission date. And 8 weeks may seem like a lot of time if we're talking vacation, but when it comes to putting a grant application together, it's a pretty tight deadline. On top of that, the submission dates are usually during the fall, which is typically a pretty busy time of the year for most people. School's back in session, the holidays are coming. I hope you picked out your Halloween costume and football's on. Second, it builds a solid planning foundation or maybe continues existing planning efforts. So in the past years, EPA has put much more emphasis on the planning associated with the project. And although some planning activities are eligible under these grants, most successful applicants began the planning process well in advance of applying. Regardless of the funding sources that you may be pursuing, it's always recommended that your project be based on sound planning practices. Third, it provides time to address EPA application emphasis areas. Again, only roughly 8 weeks to prepare the application, and the EPA emphasis areas may change from the previous year. So having certain tasks completed prior to the NOFO gives you more time during that 8-week window to focus on the new emphasis area criteria. And lastly, it allows for more involved technical assistance. So as I mentioned, NJIT Tab is a free resource to communities, and one of the things that we offer is providing grant application review and critiques. So instead of sending us your application just before submission, you can send it earlier to us, and we can provide assistance throughout its preparation. For all the EPA Brownfield grants, the narrative ranking criteria is broken down into 4 major sections. Section 1 and 2 are really your essay sections, and then section 3 and 4 are more pro forma. And again, this may all be subject to change, but I do think that there are elements of these criteria that you're likely to encounter in the future in EPA and other grants as well. namely describing your property or properties and what you want to do with it, why you need the funding, how you're going to let the public and other interested parties know about the work you're doing, and maybe why the funder should trust your organization to have the capabilities and capacity to implement the project. So whether you want to apply for federal EPA brownfield grants or maybe other grants, I want to equip you with some of the recommended action that you can take now to strengthen potential future grant applications. These are building your grant team, creating your vision, writing your story, and setting up your application. Brownfield redevelopment generally requires more partner participation than the typical real estate transaction. And this is due to several possible factors like complex history of the state, community concerns about public health impacts and safety, difficulty getting funding and financing, and then competing visions for the site's redevelopment. In addition, the cost of redeveloping a contaminated property often goes well beyond available local resources. Strong partnerships can guide community-informed decision-making, strengthen your funding applications, and build capacity to tackle complex brownfield site challenges. So when you're considering your partners, you should make sure that you identify not only those that are affected by the project itself, but also those that can bring effective resources, meaningful feedback, and communication skills to the table. Additionally, consider the different segments of your community that will be impacted by your project and the best partners to reach those populations. So there's several typical partners involved in brownfields redevelopment. For instance, agencies of the federal government such as the US EPA provides both funding, assistance, and expertise. State environmental and economic development agencies, they also bring important resources to brownfield redevelopment projects. Real estate professionals can help communities better understand the realities of the real estate market and can suggest various incentives that would help make local brownfield redevelopment projects more economically viable. A public-private partnership between a local government and a real estate developer is an effective collaboration for brownfields redevelopment, especially in weak market areas. A university or college can be a valuable partner in brownfields redevelopment. So professors, researchers, and graduate students, they may provide insight and expertise on brownfields related topics. Some universities and colleges host design studios in which students work on real world redevelopment projects. Other typical partners we see include banks and lenders, chambers of commerce or business owners, neighborhood associations and other community groups, nonprofits, environmental consultants. But in some circumstances, you should try to go above and beyond the usual suspects. There's other groups and organizations that can add value to your team, and they can offer unique and important resources. So, for instance, local artists and cultural institutions can be great partners in bringing attention to brownfield sites, suggesting creative ways to engage the community in envisioning the property's reuse, and maybe even in creatively marketing the sites. You're going to want to assemble your team well before the grant deadline. So project roles that you may want to consider are project manager, leads the team, coordinates communications, works with partners, and tracks progress. Technical expert, qualified environmental professional who understands assessment, remediation, and/or redevelopment. Your financial manager will keep track of budgets and invoices. A community engagement coordinator will oversee the creation and also implementation of the community engagement plan. Legal expert has a deep understanding of federal and state regulations and compliance, and purchasing agent tracks compliance with procurement regulations. So how can you put this team together? The first thing is check with your internal team. What can your current staff handle? After that, call on the experts. But remember, you have to follow federal procurement guidelines. Additionally, don't forget to talk with your EPA project officer who may be able to help you. Your regional EPA office may be able to help you develop an RFP that complies with regulations, clearly identifies the services needed, and is executed in good faith. And on top of that, your tab provider, NJIT Tab, is also able to review your RFP and ensure compliance as well. So for more information, you can also view our tab how-to video on grant project teams on our website. Now, garnering community support does involve educating communities and community groups early in that process, and then actively involving those entities throughout the process until the ultimate redevelopment. A critical element of the competitive EPA Brownfield grant application is the development of an effective community engagement plan. Now, that doesn't really mean that you have to have all of the tasks associated with community engagement completed prior to submission, But you can start thinking about what your engagement plan will look like and start that outreach process. So community outreach methods may include but aren't limited to public surveys, informational workshops, publications and or web pages chronicling activities. And we also have a how-to video on how to reach your community on our website as well. So why take the time to build your team? It's because you want to avoid common EPA Brownfield grant mistakes. So in this presentation, I also sprinkled in a few mistakes that we do see in grant applications quite often. So in the community engagement section of the grant application, applicants make the mistake of going for quantity versus quality of partners. On top of that, applicants tend to have redundant project roles. Building your team now is going to help you select meaningful partners with meaningful roles and then reflect this in your grant application as well. Additional community engagement mistakes are that applicants discuss community input as a necessary requirement instead of a meaningful effort. And applicants don't discuss how the garnered input will be considered in the project. Starting community engagement now is going to help you discuss how the input from the community engagement plans is going to be meaningfully incorporated into the project. It will also give you time to identify and engage the populations that are most negatively impacted by unremediated brownfields, and then find ways to meaningfully engage them in the project as well. Now, common mistakes that we see in the programmatic capabilities section are that applicants don't include an organizational structure and describe how it will function. We do see that often with applicants describing an organizational structure, stating it, but not describing how it's going to function amongst each other. Additionally, applicants forget to reference in accordance with 2 CFR Part 200 or higher procurement standard. Excuse me. So building your team now is going to allow you to set up your organizational structure and get the experts on board you need, like maybe a purchasing agent, to make sure that you cross your T's and you dot your I's. All right, so we've built our team and now it's time to create our vision. The first thing we need to do is identify our brownfields. A brownfield inventory is a list of properties that meet the definition of a brownfield in a defined area. Now, the list also includes each site's associated attributes and data like maybe ownership information, street address, lot size, environmental conditions, site access. This list can later be used to identify prioritization criteria. Now, a map should accompany this list, which will show the distribution and location of brownfields within your community. This inventory will help inform what sort of resources will be needed to address the brownfields challenges. So before creating a brownfield inventory from scratch, check that your community doesn't already have one. Again, for an in-depth walkthrough of how to create a brownfield inventory, we also have a learning module on that. So let's explain what a geographic area is. In simple terms, it's the area you're going to conduct eligible activities with your grant funds. So your geographic boundary should include an area that suffers from brownfield challenges and impacts that you can quantify with data. And I'm going to go into data a little bit in a moment. So it can include the applicants, and in some cases, a coalition member's jurisdictional or service area boundaries, or maybe a sub area of those boundaries. Regardless of the area selected, it should make sense in terms of your overall project plan and goals. You also want to make sure that you specifically describe the boundaries of your geographic area, like using roadways, rail lines, rivers, and so on. Now, a target area is basically an area within the geographic area that has some type of cohesive element that distinguishes it. For example, a downtown district, community gateway, waterfront area, industrial district, corridors, rail, highway, and so on. So why is it important to delineate a target area? Why do we do this? The first thing is it serves as the foundation for a comprehensive planning approach. It shows that some forethought has gone into a brownfields project, and that reassures the EPA that a project has a higher probability for success. That's the kind of project that the EPA wants to invest in with its brownfield grants. Second, it helps identify priority brownfields, which is a requirement in EPA brownfield grant applications. In your EPA brownfield grant, you're going to highlight those priority brownfield sites that best make your project case by emphasizing community needs and having the characteristics to potentially meet your project goals. It also enables you to identify sites that can be assembled to meet the needs for larger redevelopment types. Third, it helps focus redevelopment scenarios that meet the needs of the community. So having a target area identified with common community needs is going to make it easier to determine what type of redevelopment best serves that community. And lastly, it helps leverage funding. By having a target area with identified specific needs, it makes it easier to identify what kind of funding sources could be pursued to finance a project. And then it's laid the foundation for applying for those funding resources as well. So similarly to the geographic area, when you're applying for an EPA Brownfield grant, it's critical to be specific when describing the boundaries of your target area. You don't just want to say the northeast quadrant of the city or town or the XYZ neighborhood. You want to describe the exact boundaries, streets, rail line, and or rivers. Just remember that the EPA reviewer has likely maybe never stepped foot in your community, maybe never will. So you want to paint a picture as much as possible about the area that you're discussing. This railway to the north and this waterfront to the east, and so on and so forth. All right, I know I mentioned data. How does data or information gathering play into the determination and description of your target area? For starters, it's critical in establishing your community's need or needs. Whenever possible, you want to back up any statements you make in describing your community's challenges with supporting evidence. If you make the statement about declining population, high unemployment, high incidence of disease, you want to cite census and health data sources to support that claim. Data also supports project goals by defining the community needs and therefore informing potential redevelopment types. Note that your community needs should match your project goals. Data also plays a role in defining the exact boundaries of your target area to have a more competitive EPA Brownfields grant application. So what do I mean by that? If extending the boundary of your target area would enable you to include a census tract that has data associated with it, that makes a stronger case for community needs, so maybe high unemployment, lack of services, excuse me, then it would be wise for you to make that adjustment. So adjusting that target area boundary may also enable you to include brownfield sites that would then make strong candidates for priority sites in your application. Now, another element of a grant application is the identification of relevant planning efforts and documentation. As I mentioned earlier, EPA places much emphasis on the planning related to these brownfield application projects. And the reason for this is that a project based on solid planning has a greater chance of success. Good planning is a great indicator of community support and commitment to taking projects through to redevelopment. And this is not only important in the eyes of the EPA, but also developers. They want to see what they have will be, minimal obstacles in developing a property. And for any developer, time is money and a huge factor in whether a project is financially viable or not. Some plans that you should consider when developing a brownfield application include target area specific redevelopment plans, master plans, zoning, or maybe transportation plans. Now, based on all the information that you've reviewed and collected, it's time to determine and describe your priority brownfield sites. So choosing the best sites to include in your application can really make or break your brownfield grant application. Why is this so important? The first thing is it shows a comprehensive approach and that you've given careful thought to the project. Second, it makes the best case for your application story, and you want to choose sites that have the best associated data to make your case. And third, it focuses your project goals. So by that, I mean, if your project goal is open and green space, you want to have selected sites that can accommodate this type of reuse and is supported by consistent planning. So when you select your sites, you want to think about, does the site meet EPA's definition of a brownfield? Confirm with the EPA regional office that your site is eligible. Is the site located within the target area or project emphasis areas such as downtown or gateway? Is there an existing brownfield inventory, and are you drawing your sites from that inventory? Does the data associated with your priority sites highlight your community's challenges to the greatest extent possible? And also, do your priority sites have the potential to meet your project goals? Again, if your project goals are for open space or residential, make sure that the sites can accommodate that type of reuse. Again, we're going to want to go through this effort of creating our vision early so that we can avoid common EPA Brownfield grant mistakes. Now, common mistakes in the reuse strategy section include maybe project goals and outcomes not aligning with the existing community revitalization efforts. Here, it's important to demonstrate that your plan exists within the context of the plans that came before it. Competitive applications will have a project and outcomes that align with existing community revitalization efforts, so you want to demonstrate that you have plans to get from A to Z to ensure success. After explaining the reuse strategy, next comes the strategy for leveraging resources. While this includes funding sources, it also includes community investments and existing infrastructures. Learn about community investment like streetscape improvements, utility upgrades, and existing infrastructure to be leveraged: water, sewer, gas, electric, transportation, maybe even high-speed internet, to determine any upgrades that will be required to meet your project goals. In terms of priority brownfield sites, again, make sure that you provide site details and demonstrate a comprehensive approach with priority sites that make the best case for your application story and focus on project goals. You want your project to seem very cohesive in that sense. So now that we've built our team and created our vision, it's time to write our story. So earlier I stressed the importance of gathering data to support your claims in your application, and that remains true. Typically, for EPA grant applications, you've had to collect information on sensitive populations such as older adults, young children, low-income communities. You've had to collect information on threats to sensitive populations like crime, substance abuse, unemployment, and critical service gaps. And you've also had to demonstrate how these populations have suffered from higher incidences of disease and adverse health conditions like cancer, asthma, and heart disease. Public data sources for this kind of demographic and public health information are plentiful. For example, the US Census Bureau, CDC, National Environmental Health Tracking Network, and the City Health Dashboard can all be very, very useful. If you need further assistance with getting your narrative down in a compelling way that incorporates data and emotion to appeal to different audience members, check out this previously recorded webinar on our website about the importance of storytelling in your Brownfields work. I love storytelling. I was a theater kid, full disclosure, in high school, and I think it's so important in Brownfields work. Sometimes it's really overlooked, but there's a story behind these sites, why they were once a huge part of your community and served your community as an asset, why they're vacant now, and what they can be turned into to benefit your community. And one thing we like to say, ordinary doesn't get funded. All right, in addition to getting an early jump on application content, there's some administrative tasks that must be done early on as well. I will say this is a little bit less fun. This is going into the more forms part of the application process. So there's a process to make sure that your account is set up so that you can actually submit your grant application to the EPA. And this needs to be done in a certain order. It's going to entail signing up at sam.gov, obtaining your unique entity identifier or UEI, and then using that UEI to submit the application and forms through grants.gov. Moving on to the more technical aspects of the grant applications, here's some information on the requirements and then some common pitfalls that we see. Also note that this is an order of how it should be completed. If you've already done this for other programs and you already have a UEI, check this anyway to make sure that your account is active through the deadline. We've actually worked with some people who check their UEI to, double check that it's still active or working, and they found out it was in the name of someone who was previously with their team and they had to switch it over, and that can take a lot of time. So that's why we're kind of pushing people to do this sooner. The past couple of years, the application due date has been before Thanksgiving, so if your UEI maybe expires this summer, you're going to want to make sure that you reactivate it. It needs to be reactivated annually. So some other piece of advice, do not use someone else's UEI. Keep in mind that you must be the authorized organization representative, or AOR, to submit the application through grants.gov. And you need to know and remember your password. If you use the same password for everything, like me, and if someone finds out that password, that's not good. Use a password manager. I started using one and it changed my life. Highly recommend it. So here's what it looks like when you get started registering your organization in sam.gov. Before you sit down to do it, look at this checklist and gather all the stuff that you need for this. It's a lot of stuff. So for example, you don't just input your address, you're going to need certain documents to provide proof that that's your address. It's like the DMV. You don't want to forget everything, including your birth certificate. It might take you a little bit to gather all this stuff, and you don't really want to be scrambling to do it the day before it's due. So you can and you should start now. Excuse me. It will give you the option to get started with the UEI only and without registration. But if you're intending on applying for a grant, you do not want to do this. So the purpose of registering your organization on sam.gov is to register your organization to be able to apply for grant opportunities. So once the account becomes active, you have, it's about 2 weeks or so, you're going to receive your unique entity identifier, or UEI, for this organization, for your organization. And this is how grants.gov is going to identify your organization. So the point of contact manages the online account and manages the activities in grants.gov. And you can assign different roles in sam.gov. The person who will submit the application in grants.gov is called the Authorized Organization Representative, or AOR, as I mentioned. And this is also the person that would be informed should there be any errors in the application. You are allowed to fix the error and resubmit before the deadline, which is another reason to get this done early. So now that you've received your UEI and you can sign up for grants.gov, you're going to submit your application in the grants.gov workplace. In addition to the project narrative, you're also going to need to fill out these forms. So first is the SF-424 application for federal assistance. This is general information about your organization, including the UEI that you receive from sam.gov, your organization's name and address, contact information, and what you're applying for. There's some other details on here that you might need to look up, like congressional districts and if this project is subject to state review. Don't wait until the last minute to pull this together. SF-424A is detailed information on your budget, which you might not be able to answer right now if you don't really have a good handle on the scope of your proposal yet, or maybe cost estimates. Something to note, the name of this form is Budget Information for Non-Construction Programs. But there may be things associated with your brownfield project that are considered construction to the federal government, like asbestos abatement or excavation. You don't need a separate form for these activities. There is a construction line item on the form. Form 5754 is your key contacts. So the contact info for the person submitting the application, the payee, your administrative contact, your project manager. This one's pretty straightforward. And then EPA Form 4704 is to screen your organization's eligibility to receive federal funds. You need to list pending lawsuits and administrative complaints related to discrimination. Required attachments. So a state letter is required for all grant types. For multi-purpose, assessment, and RLF, it's just basically an acknowledgement letter from the state saying, yep, we're aware that you're applying for the grant. For cleanup, it's more in-depth. The EPA is asking the state to verify that the site is ready for cleanup. So this means going back and looking at all the work that's been done, reviewing those reports to make sure no other investigation work needs to be done. Think about it. It's going to take some lead time. State offices are very busy and they will work with you, but the more notice you can give them, the better. Speaking of cleanup grants, there's another unique requirement, and that is community notification and outreach along with your ABCA, or Analysis of Brownfields Cleanup Alternatives. This is where you're going to inform the community of what your plan is for cleanup. So again, think about the lead time that's going to be needed for this. You need to set the date for the outreach event at least 14 days before you submit the application. You need to give the public opportunity to review your plan, make comments on it, and you need to compile those comments and any responses. We don't really want to wait until they release the guidelines. Let's try to get these activities rolling this summer, or at least finalizing your ABCA and being confident with your selected remedy. So for cleanup grant applications, the attachments you're going to need are a copy of the draft ABCA or ABCAs, a copy of the newspaper ad or equivalent that demonstrates solicitation for comments on the application, and that notification to the public occurred at least 14 calendar days before the application was submitted to EPA. An equivalent method may include, for example, a dated image of the website or a copy of the listserv message that was used to notify the public. This is going to include comments or a summary of the comments received as well, the applicant's response to those public comments, meeting notes or summary from the public meetings, and meeting sign-in sheet or participant list. And just to summarize my portion of the presentation and some things that we've seen with grant reviews, I really like to end by going over these helpful tips at the end of the presentation for everyone to really keep in mind as you get started, write your grant application, and move forward. Read the guideline and resource materials thoroughly. Follow the guideline outline, don't get creative. Use tables when appropriate. It saves space. And there are some sections where the EPA will suggest using tables as well. Do not include maps or photos in the application. I will say, I think that this is actually different for fiscal year 26. I believe you are allowed to use maps in the application. And I can double check on that as well. Don't skip questions because you don't have information or data. You need to hit every single thing in the guideline that they're requesting for criteria. So if one thing doesn't apply to you, don't just skip it. Say that it doesn't apply to you. Excuse me. Do not add hyperlinks to data or other information. This is important. The EPA reviewer cannot click on hyperlinks. They cannot leave the application when they're reviewing it. So don't include that. Get one person to edit the application and get someone who knows nothing about the project to review your application. That's really helpful. Again, as I mentioned before, the EPA reviewer may have never stepped foot in your community. Maybe they never will. Maybe they never heard of it. So if you have someone reviewing your application that's never heard about your project, never heard about your community, and they have feedback, so will the reviewer. And then finally, if you hire a consultant, just make sure they tell the story that you want told. And with that, I have my contact information up here. You can reach me via email, by number, and I'm going to pass it over to Aditi Chakravarti with the US EPA Region 4.
Great. All right. Thank you so much, Elise. Okay. So, hello, everyone. My name is Aditi Chakravarti. I am a EPA Brownfields Project Officer, and I will be giving an overview of the EPA Brownfields grants process in this presentation. Over here, we have a map of the 8 states that make up EPA Region 4. In addition to the 8 states, we also work with 4 tribes. Those include the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians, Seminole Tribe of Florida, Mississippi Band of Choctaw, and Catawba Indian Nation. To start us off, here's a broad outline of what the Brownfields process looks like. It starts with the assessment component, where we try to figure out if the property is contaminated, what type of contaminants may be present, the extent of contamination, and then formulating a plan if needed. That takes us into the cleanup portion of the process. Some properties require cleanup, which is where the grants and other types of assistance can help. In cases where a property doesn't need to undergo cleanup, it's deemed what we call ready for anticipated use, which means that you can move forward with redevelopment without cleanup. The final part of the process is the redevelopment component, which is the end goal of the Brownfields process, where we have now found a beneficial use for a property that was previously underused. This is where land revitalization comes in, which aims to enhance site reuse. We can look at EPA Brownfield support for communities through 4 critical buckets. The bulk of what we do is in grants, which is comprised of our assessment grants, cleanup grants, multi-purpose, and revolving loan fund grants. There are also several types of technical assistance offered by EPA Brownfields, such as grant management training, funding to your technical assistance providers, which is NJIT for Region 4, and then land revitalization planning. We also have our targeted brownfield assessments, the TBAs, which are specific contractual resources that are offered through EPA to perform assessments. And finally, we offer numerous tools and resources on our website in the form of toolkits, trainings, guidance documents, etc. Those resources are constantly being updated, so make sure that you are checking the EPA Brownfield landing page for information. Okay. When entering into the Brownfields grant process, there are a couple of elements to keep in mind. Programmatic requirements will be outlined in the terms and conditions document that is shared with your awards document at the beginning of your award period. Grantees need to make sure that they are familiar with the programmatic requirements for their particular grant because there is an expectation for continuous project involvement and oversight from the grantee. We also want to make sure that implementation of the grant is supported by the community, which is where community engagement comes in. Here we like to see regular and ongoing solicitation of stakeholder input. This can look like regularly scheduled meetings and regularly scheduled and accessible meetings, that are open to the public, and the input that is shared during these meetings are collected and integrated into planning activities. When it comes to assessment or cleanup activities, flexible and well-timed completion of environmental work on brownfield sites is a major component of successful brownfields grant management. Keep in mind that grants are typically awarded for 4 or 5 year periods, and then knocking out certain goals on the front end of the grant, such as putting out your RFP and securing a qualified contractor, will leave more time for tackling site-specific activities later on in the grant. Finally, planning for the best end use of brownfield sites helps communities align brownfields redevelopment with broader economic and community development goals, such as job creation, housing, infrastructure improvements. These are all things we typically see. So here's a Gantt chart for assessment grants, visualizing some of the things we talked about on the last slide. Programmatic requirements and community engagement are necessary throughout the lifetime of your grant, and you'll likely be working closely with your consultant throughout the management of the grant as well. We also discussed that getting certain activities done at the beginning of your grant, such as finalizing your team and having a site inventory and general QAP in place, will allow for site-specific activities to go forward later on in your grant. The assessment work conducted under your grant is typically broken out into a couple of standard reports. You have your all appropriate inquiries form, which is essentially a due diligence document that goes hand in hand with the phase 1 environmental site assessment, which details your property's history, current and past uses, potential environmental concerns that may affect the site, things along those lines. Once you have your phase 1 completed for a site, you can determine if you want to use your funding towards a phase 2, which requires a site eligibility determination and site-specific quality assurance plan. The phase 2 is where actual environmental data collection occurs at a selected property, which is why you need an approved site eligibility determination form to make sure that the requirements for brownfields funding is being met and that your proposed scope is appropriate. Finally, once you have the site data in hand, you can begin planning activities, which includes an analysis of brownfields cleanup alternative document, or that ABCA. And this outlines the evaluation of different cleanup options for a site. This document can help inform the grantee if pursuing a brownfields cleanup grant makes sense. This takes us into what we typically envision for the cleanup grant process. Once again, your programmatic requirements, consultant oversight, and community engagement are anticipated to take place throughout the lifetime of the grant. Some unique aspects to consider for a cleanup grant are also laid out here. Early on, you might want to consider enrolling your cleanup site into the state brownfields program, which NCDEQ will provide, I think, further detail on during the summit in October. But considering this avenue earlier is helpful because the state program may have different baseline assessment requirements from EPA, and this will guide assessment and corresponding cleanup work at a site. The institutional and environmental controls that are implemented once assessment and cleanup is completed will also be subject to requirements outlined in your brownfields agreement with the state. So taking a step back from the nitty-gritty details, please keep in mind that the notice of award is a legally binding document. Once you are selected as a Brownfields grant recipient and submit all the required documents, such as your formalized work plan, budget, worksheet, that SF424, you will receive a notice of award. If you draw down your funds or do not submit a notice of disagreement within 21 days after receiving the NOA, you are considered to have accepted the award. So just something to keep in mind. The notice of award will have the terms and conditions attached to it, which outlines the programmatic requirements for your award. Please make sure that you carefully review this. Your Brownfields project officer will also review the terms and conditions with you and answer any questions you may have. Some more reminders for your terms and conditions, or your T's and C's. The T's and C's follow the money, not just a grantee. So every contract and subcontract associated with the grant are also subject to the T's and C's and should therefore, and you should therefore be familiar with them. They apply to everyone and they apply to everyone that works with the grant, and ultimately the grantee is responsible for making sure that they are being shared, followed, and implemented. This is a very high-level look of what's actually covered by T's and C's. You can expect to see federal policy and guidance, which includes cross-cutting requirements such as Davis-Bacon and historic preservation, programmatic requirements, substantial involvement and eligible costs. These are all covered under your programmatic requirements. Administrative requirements from EPA and Brownfields program will also be covered here. A lot of what we discussed on the Gantt chart slides will also be outlined under work plan requirements. And finally, your T's and C's will outline how payment and grant closeout will be conducted. So what does sufficient progress for a grant look like? There are two major milestones outlined here under 18 months and 30 months. At 18 months, a grantee needs to demonstrate that at least 25% of funds have been drawn down. A QEP solicitation has been released. You have a site inventory. Community involvement activities have been initiated. And for cleanup grants, that an appropriate cleanup plan is in place. At 30 months, at least 45% of the funds should be drawn down. The QEP should be procured at this point, and at least 2 sites have been assessed, and other documented activities have occurred that show that the grantee will successfully perform the cooperative agreement. EPA Brownfields awards are cooperative agreements, which means that EPA will be substantially involved. This means that performance of the cooperative agreement recipient, or the CARC, will be closely monitored. So this basically means that you'll be working closely with your Brownfields project officer, have regularly scheduled meetings. Project officer will review or comment on quarterly and annual reports that are submitted. They also review your sites for eligibility, the quality assurance project plans, and general documents that are submitted and updated throughout the life of your grant. Project officers also conduct annual baseline reviews and advanced monitoring reports for grantees. So in general, just the takeaway from this is that it's a good idea to stay in communication with your project officer. And if you run into any troubles or issues, that's easier to tackle on the front end, instead of later on in your grant. So this slide goes into cooperative agreement recipient responsibilities. So these are just, some of the responsibilities the CAR should be keeping in mind. Quarterly reporting on acres and drawdowns on ASAP will be expected. You'll need to maintain records that will be reported to EPA on the amount of funds that are being dispersed. As I mentioned earlier, communicate with EPA on problems, delays, or any conditions that impact what is outlined in the approved work plan. So this could include scheduling issues, milestones, any kind of budget issues. So again, your PO is a resource and we'll work with you to resolve these issues before it becomes a programmatic concern. And then this last slide summarizes some of the eligible and ineligible costs under a Brownfields grant. Generally, funds can be used for site inventory, characterization, remediation. This is what goes into generating your phase 1 and phase 2 environmental site assessment reports, your quality assurance plans, and your ABCAs. Making sure that you're complying with state and federal laws, purchasing environmental insurance, planning activities, which can include land use and site reuse assessment, market studies, community health assessments. And there's a whole suite of planning documents also available on the EPA Brownfields website. And those, I feel like that list is also constantly expanding. So please make sure to check that out. And then keep in mind, if you have an assessment grant, you can't use funding towards cleanup activities. Funding can also not be used towards site development activities, job training. We have separate funding for that. And then paying for any penalties or fines or paying towards writing other grants. And then please stay on the call for more information on the Regional Brownfield Summit. But that's everything for me. Thank you, everyone.
All right. Thank you, Aditi, and thank you, Elise, for the great information that you all shared. And we're going to take questions in just a moment, but I did want to just encourage everyone to save the date for our upcoming Regional Brownfield Summit. Again, as Elise mentioned, we are partnering with NJIT TAB on this event. It will be held at our office here in Charlotte on Thursday, October 30th from 10 a.m. to 2:30 p.m. And some of the topics that we are going to be covering in this event will include what qualifies as a brownfield, why they matter, again, federal and state funding programs, so going into a little more on that, that can support assessment, cleanup, and reuse. We'll have some tips and strategies for navigating challenges related to brownfields redevelopment, and then also hearing about some projects specifically for Main Street and those downtown commercial corridors in our communities. And then we'll also hear some success stories about building partnerships and engaging the community and working with some of the stakeholder groups that Elise mentioned earlier. So this event is free, and we will include the link to register for that in the follow-up email. I think Maylin also was able to drop that in the chat if you were able to see that. So with that, I will open the floor for any questions. If you feel free to come off mute, or if you have a question you want to put in the chat, you can do that as well. Well, while we're waiting for folks to ask their questions, or I have one question for both of you. What would you say from your experience and from what you've seen or heard is the biggest reason communities maybe don't apply for brownfields grants? And if there's anything you could say to them that would help them overcome their concerns, what might that be?
I would say a lot of the times it's because maybe the community hasn't been involved in brownfields too much or dove into the field of brownfields. Or maybe they just, and this is very valid, think that it's just a lot of work and they may not have the capacity to apply or put all those materials together to apply for the grant application, manage the grant application, so on. And one thing that I would tell them is that, you know, the EPA has established several technical assistance programs and resources out there for communities like yours. If you think that this may apply to you, if maybe you're a little bit hesitant, if this was a lot of information, which I know it was, there's resources available to assist you. The EPA has a lot of resources on their websites, guidelines, you know, questions, FAQs, and then on top of that, the TAB program, the Technical Assistance to Brownfield Communities program. And then one other thing I would tell them is look to the organizations and the entities that have done this, that are currently managing their grants, that are currently applying for their grants, that maybe are just ending their grants. And this could include Centralina Regional Council. They have experience with this and they're, you know, a local resource as well. So I think that taking advantage of all the different resources, it may be difficult to find all the different ones and pull them all together, but there are people and places and organizations out there to help you through the grant application process.
Yeah, I think Elise covered everything. I don't know if I have anything to add to that, but that's great.
Yeah, I would only add that as a grant recipient, both of you and your organizations have been extremely helpful to us. So I can definitely echo what you said, Elise, about the support and the assistance that exists and the resources that you all offer. And personally, on a personal note, as somebody who's very new to Brownfields and still learning just about every day, I found that those resources especially helpful as well as I'm working my way through this funding opportunity that we were able to get. Thank you.
Great to hear.
And then I guess there is one quick thing I want to mention. So EPA actually posts, they'll, at the end of a cycle, they'll list the successful and unsuccessful grant applications. And I know in prior years, you can also pull the applications that were submitted from grantees. So that is sometimes a valuable resources for communities to take a look at as well.
That's good to know. Yeah, I think that would be very helpful for people to see what's what has worked for others and what led to success. Are there any other funding opportunities that maybe could complement a Brownfields grant that people might not think of immediately? Whether that's a grant or some other type of funding.
I think there's a lot. It could definitely depend on location, state. That's actually one thing that we can also assist with is, you know, EPA, the fiscal year 26 EPA grants, there's a lot of money being offered. But as I mentioned, brownfields take many different funding sources, grants, tax incentives, loans, so on. So there's a bunch of different resources, and that's one thing that we can assist with is, you know, helping create a funding stack is what we call it. And this is a list of funding resources that you could pursue with your project. And typically with this, we would like to kind of know what your project reuse vision is, because sometimes there's grants that are specific to that. So maybe your reuse vision is a park. There may be grants out there that, you know, are trying to fund more open spaces and parks in urban areas or something like that. So there's a lot of different resources out there. I can't say that I would list right off the top of my head some, but yeah, sometimes it does take a little bit of research. That's what we can do for you guys. Again, all of our assistance is free, but yeah, there's different things out there for different site reuse visions, and yeah, different components of your project.
Any other questions? All right, well, this was a lot of great information, so I hope you all are kind of processing that and taking it in, and that you will have found some inspiration to help you all as you think about or plan to think about applying for brownfields opportunities. So I did want to share everyone's contact information. So if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us. The Centralina team's contact information is there, mine and Kasha's, as well as Elisa's and Aditi's as well. Also, please be on the lookout for the follow-up email that was mentioned that will contain the recording from today, as well as the links to the upcoming October 30th summit. And we hope that you all will join us then and continue your brownfields exploration with us at that event. So if there are no other questions, we will give you all about 19 minutes back to your day. But thank you again for joining us, and we hope you have a great rest of your day.